Hello, everyone. How are you doing? And welcome to another episode of the Dr. Will Show. I am your host, Dr. Will, and I'm geeking out right now. I got the mock-up PDF of my article that just came out in Tech Edge magazine. Have a subscription. Check it out. Holler at me on Twitter. Let me know. Uh, you know, be gentle though. If it sucked, don't tell me. Just tell me I was great. All right. So we are here with Michelle Moore Race. So people, if you're still watching, keep watching. I know this is a topic that people don't want to really touch nowadays, but I felt it to go there. Michelle, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me on tonight.
Well, thank you for being a guest. I'm always shocked when people agree to be on the show. I'm not Oprah and I don't give people checks. So I'm always shocked and thankful that people will be on the show. So for those who are watching, will you please introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Michelle Moore. I'm from Tampa, Florida. I was a classroom teacher for 7 years, and for the last 2 years, I've worked in professional development for Hillsborough County Public Schools.
Excellent, excellent. As I said before, we're going to be talking about race. And I want to talk about race on this podcast because of our current political climate we find ourselves in. You know, the vitriol and downright ignorance has found its way into our schools. Had a few conversations, but they haven't felt very satisfying. How can educators have those discussions that both honor ours and our students' experiences while building the foundation for real solutions?
It's so important that we answer that question and that we find the space to kind of share about the experiences that go on every day, and also that we find a way to make the conversation an empowering one, because you never want to make anyone feel like a victim or like the other person is the problem and they need to change. So I think it starts by really coaching students to get to a solution on what they can control and just giving them the space to actually share in that with us. And I think depending on your content or what grade you teach even, it can be difficult to have that time with students.
Now, a week or so ago, I tweeted about Black History Month for me being because I'm Black every day. It's not a special month. It's just who I am and, who I am. And I celebrate myself and my history, my culture on a regular basis. How has being a Latina impacted how you see yourself in society and your roles as an educator?
Oh, yeah. And those are just two huge loaded questions, kind of. But just to give you a little background, I was born in Venezuela, but for the most part, I was raised in Tampa, Florida. And when we first came to Tampa, the neighborhood we moved into was just like a white suburb. And for most of my friends in school, they had stay-at-home moms. And when they went home, a snack was served and mom was there to help with homework, and maybe they got to watch a little bit of TV or go play outside, and then they had dinner as a family. On the flip side of that, I came from a single parent home. My mom worked, 40 to 60 hours a week, depending on what was going on. And I was the typical latchkey kid. So I went home every day, made my own snack, hung out for a little bit, did my homework by myself. And sometimes mom was getting home early and I'd wait for her for dinner, or sometimes, there were leftovers in the fridge and I'd eat dinner by myself. It was just a very different world. And it really gave me that us and them and the haves and the have not mentality, where it was like, well, I must not deserve that kind of life, or, college is for those kinds of people. And it was really hard breaking that stereotype that I made for myself. I think what made me want to go into education was being able to help those types of students. I had a very amazing math teacher freshman year in high school who really reached out to me and, tried to save me in a way. She saw something, she was that teacher that we all go back and think about. And I wanted to be that for other people and show them, it is equal opportunity. And that's the great thing about America. That's why my mom came here from Venezuela, because she knew anything is possible. You can work for it. You can go to college. You can, live the American dream, or what's left of it. And I wanted to be that teacher. So as an educator, that role definitely affected me, because I noticed I was reaching out to my minority students. I worked a lot with at-risk students, and it was so important for me to not only help them be able to find the resources, but also help my colleagues realize, and really address their own ignorances. And it's not that that kid doesn't have parents that care about him because they don't come to conference night. It's that they can't afford to take a night off work because they have to put food on the table. And it's really interesting to kind of coach teachers into seeing their own stereotypes and prejudices that they have, because maybe the minority student isn't the majority for them. Maybe they deal mostly with the haves and they forget what it's like for the other side.
So speaking of Twitter, we talk a lot about diversity, particularly when it comes to these larger EdTech conferences like ISTE. Where does the conversation on diversity fall short in the quest for inclusion?
Oh my gosh, this is like the elephant in the room. Because everybody wants to say we're inclusive, we're diverse, but numbers don't lie. I've been to a lot of those conferences, and I can tell you I did not feel like Latina women were anywhere near well represented. And it comes down to, I think, the presenters you pick are going to be the people you attract. And I look around and I see a lot of white male presenters, and I don't understand why they're surprised that most of the participants are white males. Not saying, there isn't some diversity, but it seems, as for the most part, that's the area that's most represented. And I think really, when we look at it, so that's the macro level. When we look at it at a micro level, so what does this mean for our school or within our district? We just need to look at the data. So let's look at schools. Let's look at the student achievement gap. Why is it happening? Maybe, this school has like a very small achievement gap in their at-risk students. What are they doing differently that we can kind of build on and set as a model and then grow up from there?
So let's talk about modeling and the need for students of color to see themselves reflected in their teachers and school leadership. What are your thoughts on the absence of teachers of color in many schools across the country?
So it's a huge problem, and it's probably one of the biggest problems, because before we can learn, we have to kind of trust the person that's in the front of the room. And it's interesting to me that people expect students to just respect the person in the front of the room because it's a teacher, but going into professional development, even amongst my peers, I felt like they were judging me before my mouth even opened because, oh, she looks too young. Is she the teacher? Or she's so short, or she's too skinny, and all these things that really have nothing to do with the words coming out of my mouth, yet it's all they're thinking about in their head. And sometimes I get asked all the time, well, what are you? You look like you could be Asian, or are you some kind of Italian? Like I'm a pasta. But they're so busy trying to figure out what my ethnicity is that they have no idea what's coming out of my mouth or the content of the PD. So it's important that we get people that the students can relate to in the front of the room, if for nothing else, just so that they're not thinking about all that other noise going through their head. And ultimately, because it really does give them someone to relate to. It gives them someone that can understand their experiences. one of the best stories I heard about, why it's important for students to relate to you. There was a kindergarten teacher who was reading a story to her students, and the story had something to do with like a little girl on a sidewalk, and all the kids were looking at her dumbfounded, and she couldn't figure out what was the misunderstanding. Well, it turns out most of her kids lived in the trailer park down the road that didn't have any sidewalks. So she kept saying, a sidewalk, and they had no concept of a sidewalk because they don't have sidewalks in their neighborhood. So that's a very small example of so many of the cultural misunderstandings that can happen when the person in the front of the room just has no concept of what those kids are going through at home.
So I want to throw this out there with you. There have been reported incidences of teachers saying certain things that I guess maybe in certain areas of the community may be deemed acceptable, or okay, no big deal. But when you're in this environment, and I like to think of teachers, I don't want to say above the fray, but I would hope that each of us would bring a certain intellectual curiosity and tolerance and the things to our jobs. When teachers bring those ideas, and some may call it a bias, some may not, but they bring that into the workplace, and they actually have colleagues who may not be Christian, colleagues who may be a person of color, or something that does not sort of follow what they consider to be mainstream America. How are teachers to create that dialogue, to go beyond I matter, to having that conversation of what our school should be like in terms of being responsive, not only to the community, but sort of being a beacon to the community?
Oh man, that's a hard one. And that's something, it starts with leadership, and it's something that you have to practice every day. But an example I can give you of that is once a quarter at the high school I was at, shout out to Plant High School, they had Unity Day. And when I first started teaching there, I thought it was just like a big, excuse to get out of class. And when I learned about the program, it turns out they actually hand select students to be part of the Unity Day. And the student leaders have gone through very specific training, and the guidance counselors help lead it. And they have very tough conversations about racism and cultural differences that are going on at the school and within the community. And they're given this space to kind of figure it out on their own because it's student led. Now, guidance is there kind of facilitating and helping with some of the more difficult questions that may arise or issues that may arise, because people can get very heated, obviously. But it was so empowering to me, because it's like, okay, it's not just the teachers bringing it up and addressing what needs to be addressed. This is coming straight from the students, and it's students helping each other figure out the solution and what can we do within our community to fix this and address this.
That sounds very interesting. I would like to see something like that at a school, to sort of celebrate the deliciousness of who we are as people. So the last thing I want to ask you before we go, what can be done to make our classrooms, or what are your thoughts on our classrooms becoming more culturally responsive? And what I mean by that, I'm talking about, Pernille Ripp does this excellent job in that reflect, you know, the wide ranges of what makes us human. So some of those books are written by authors of color, or those books pertaining to the characters, main characters are people of color. She has book with Muslims characters, and to really sort of bring all of that freshness and experience to her students. And not all of her students, you know, happen to be people, you know, students of color. But that doesn't happen everywhere. The history books are filled with stories that don't represent ours, and of what is considered. This is great literature. A lot of times is not considered, don't include authors who look like us. What can schools do? What are your thoughts about classroom schools actually, those topics in history, those historical figures, those authors, those writings, and putting it into the classroom to really not only sort of cultivate a different sort of knowledge and pride in the students that those authors or historians may represent, but even giving their other students a broader what is out there in the world?
I would say, as I go around visiting classrooms, and I'm very fortunate because I get to visit K through 12 in my district, and it's really great and empowering when I visit a school with a high minority majority, so a high Hispanic population or a high African American population, and I see that teachers are already doing that. So they are taking it on themselves to make sure the students are introduced to this. The problem that I run into is in schools that maybe it's like 50% white or 60% white and the rest is a mix of whatever else. Those teachers kind of, you know, teach to the middle or focus on what they need to focus on in their curriculum and feel like, oh, well, I can't read, you know, The Kite Runner because it's going to upset my white students, or I can't read certain things because PTA parents might start sending me emails. And, you know, I'm kind of the one to like just do something and ask for forgiveness later. But I think teachers really need to understand the value of it. And the value is not just for the minority student who can relate to a piece of literature, relate to something that happened in history, but it's also because we're a global community. So we can't just teach the white kids about white history because they're not just going to be working with white kids when they grow up. We are competing against the world. We're working with people from all different cultures, and we're really doing them a disservice when we make them think that the world revolves around them. So my argument would be, it's not just like you have to because you should, it's you have to because you're doing them a disservice later on in life when they realize the world doesn't revolve around them. You know, they need to be exposed to different cultures so they're not arrogant and they feel like they're cultured and they're worldly, and they can walk into a room with someone from any part of the world and say, hey, you know, I remember I read or I learned about, and have a conversation with them.
Awesome. Awesome. Thanks again, Michelle, for being a guest on the show. And I salute your bravery for having this conversation, because some people may not feel like, you know, participating because, you know, hey, friends, family, colleagues at work, anyone can see this and they may not want folks to say, hey, look at you, kind of funny because you're having this this conversation on a topic that we don't really talk about much, especially, like if incident, something happens, people, oh, it's race, and but then when the incident kind of blows away, the conversation goes away, and the dialogue doesn't continue, and we are still not where we should be in this country.
Yeah, we're not at all. And thank you. Like I said, I'll ask for forgiveness tomorrow. I'm sure I'll get some emails about someone who was listening that works in my district and they're offended that I said something, but oh well, it's a way to get the conversation going.
Awesome, awesome. As always, people, this is going to be on my blog. I'm going to put this on LinkedIn. I'm going to tweet it out on YouTube as well as SoundCloud. As always, people, invest in you. Peace.